Now, Melanie Phillips doesn't need an introduction for most people here. I think as one of the leading thinkers and speakers in the Jewish world, most people would be familiar with her. But for those who aren't, Melanie was a journalist with The Guardian. She was there for she was there for decades, and then she saw the light. And Melanie has become, she's written several books. I think perhaps the most well-known one, which a lot of people here would have, is Londonistan. That was the first one I came across. Melanie has just written her latest book, which has just been released, hot off the presses. You can only purchase it from one place, and that's on Amazon. So I would encourage everyone here to buy a copy of Melanie's book, because it's one thing to hear a really good speaker, it's another thing to actually sit down and internalize it. So I think that's all I want to say about Melanie. She's an amazing speaker. Please give her a round of applause.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert. And thank you for mentioning my misbegotten youth at The Guardian. As I am fond of telling my former Guardian colleagues, it is The Guardian that made me what I am today. And strangely, that doesn't seem to go down too well when I say that to them. It's a very, very great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to see you all here this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here in Melbourne and in Australia. I have, I think, just about worked out what day it is, and it's just in time for me to go back to London tomorrow. I'm extremely grateful to the AJA for bringing me out here to Melbourne and to Brisbane. The AJA is fighting the good fight in the right kind of way. I know it's the right kind of way because they agree with me. I've actually been quite overwhelmed, quite frankly, by the reception I've had speaking in Sydney and Brisbane and already in Melbourne. I mean, I'm just bowled over by the Australian Jewish community in particular. I know you're having a very tough time at the moment, and we're going to speak about that. But you are such feisty and good people. And I have been so inspired by speaking to you all, particularly by young people, the determination and commitment that they have to face down the evil that we're all facing. But I will take back to Britain and back to Israel, where I mainly live, the memory and the inspiration of all you good people. When I told my friends, my close friends and colleagues in Jerusalem that I was coming to Israel, and as you know, Israel, it's the seat of the Third World War, basically. When I told them I was coming to Australia, they said, "Oh my goodness, it's so unsafe there." I'm happy to say that I have been extremely well looked after, and I have enjoyed every moment of being here. So as I've said, you're facing an unprecedented crisis here in Australia, and it's a crisis, as we know, that's going on throughout the West. And we all know that anti-Semitism never dies, but I think nothing could have prepared us for what we have been living through in these last 16 months. The depraved atrocities of October 7, 2023 have produced, I'm afraid to say, a morally depraved response across the West. After those atrocities, one might have thought that the so-called civilised world would have understood Israel's need to defend itself against an explicitly genocidal agenda, a seven-front war waged by Iran and its proxies to wipe Israel off the map and kill every Jew. That's what they have told us they intended to do and still intend to do. But instead, apparently triggered by the single biggest attack on Jews since the Holocaust, much of the so-called civilized world turned instead against Israel and the Jewish people. I don't need to tell you. We saw physical and verbal attacks on Jews. We saw these enormous demonstrations on the streets of Western cities in which demonstrators were calling for the destruction of Israel, the murder of Jews, jihad, intifada, and so on. Many of these chants, certainly in Britain, and I believe it's not dissimilar to here in Australia, many of these chants were actually in Britain against English law. And the police nevertheless stood by and let it all happen, failing to enforce the laws against intimidation, failing to enforce the laws against calls for the murder of Jews, failing to enforce the laws against, and there is indeed a law on the statute book in Britain, a law that criminalises calling for the destruction of another country. All these laws were broken and are being broken virtually every day. Jews in London are frightened to go across the city when these demonstrations are taking place because of the intimidation. And recently it was quite surreal. When I'm in London, I attend a synagogue in central London, which happens to be near the BBC. The big demonstrations have often started at the BBC because, get this, the BBC, which has incited hatred against Israel for the last N months and years, in fact, is regarded by these demonstrators as being too pro-Israel. And that's because the BBC doesn't every 5 seconds say that Israel should be exterminated from the face of the earth, and thus it's pro-Israel. But anyway, so they tended to gather near the BBC, where they started their procession through the streets of central London, and that position is very near the synagogue that I generally go to when I'm in London. It's a few streets away, and I've been there when one of these demonstrations has gone past, and it's very frightening to be inside the synagogue with people screaming and shouting outside, and you think, any moment now you're going to get a brick through the window. Anyway, finally, the police decided to do something about this and told the organisers of the march, of the demonstration that was being planned for, I think, 2 weeks hence, you need to move the place where you're starting this demonstration a few hundred yards, just a few streets away, and you're not to go near the synagogue. And this produced hysterical screams of our freedom of speech is being suppressed. And this went on and on and on. And on the day, they formed a phalanx of, we saw them, at the front of the demonstration, we are upholding our democratic freedom to intimidate Jews. That's what it was. They wanted to intimidate Jews in that synagogue. And the police, actually, they held the line, they fought them back, and there were dozens of arrests. But what is going on here when people quite openly want to intimidate Jews going about their business of praying in a synagogue? You have to ask what is going on here. So we've also seen, the media pumping out Hamas propaganda as entirely reliable, and while casting doubts and aspersions on anything the Israelis say as intrinsically unreliable. We've seen the rebranding of Zionism as Nazism, and Jews treated as beyond the pale. To me, one of the most disturbing and thought-provoking occurrences in this whole terrible period has been what I'm sure we all saw, especially in the first few months after October 7, this extraordinary phenomenon of people tearing down the pictures, the posters of the hostages from public places, walls, lamp standards, and so on. And we saw some of the video coverage of people tearing these things down. We saw their faces convulsed with hatred and rage. Now you have to ask yourself, these weren't posters, advertising, come and join the IDF and have a great time. They weren't saying anything about Israel. These were pictures of babies, of children, of women, and of men who had been kidnapped and who we all knew were likely to be being ill-treated, starved, tortured, raped, murdered, whatever. What is going through the mind of somebody whose face is convulsed with hatred and rage as they have to tear down a picture of a kidnapped, brutalized child. And you have to ask yourself, at that time I just looked at these pictures and I thought, this video coverage, and I thought, this is something much more even than, anti-Semitism or anti-Israel hatred or leftists going bonkers. This is something else. What is this? And I think that all these things together represented a kind of pathological, obsessional response to events in the Middle East. A kind of response not seen anywhere in the world ever, about any cause, about any people, about anything. And I think that this response has shaken a lot of people to the core. And in my view, the people who have been particularly shaken, maybe we've all been shaken, we've all been horrified, all decent people have been horrified, Jews have been particularly horrified for obvious reasons. But I think that nevertheless, particularly shaken have been people from the liberal side of politics, people from the liberal side of politics who are basically decent people, who have not lost their minds completely, because they're looking at what's been going on, and they can see that this onslaught on decency, on conscience, on evidence, on reason, this onslaught has been conducted by people on the left liberal side of politics, their side of politics, in concert with Muslims. It's called the Red-Green Alliance, and it's an unholy alliance between people on the one hand promoting progressive ideologies, and on the other hand, those whose worldview would erase completely the progressive way of life, Islamists, by which I mean those Muslims who interpret Islam as a holy war in which they believe they must do the work of God to Islamize the world. Not all Muslims sign up to that. Too many do, and they're the kind of people we've seen on the streets making common cause with liberals against Israel. Liberals or progressives who have joined them in the common cause, which is a twofold cause: hatred of Israel and the Jewish people, and hatred of the West. Now you have to ask yourself, how can the progressive world have joined forces like this with the most reactionary people in the world? How can liberals, who profess themselves to be committed to anti-racism, be walking shoulder to shoulder with people alongside people chanting for the killing of Jews? How can feminists who have campaigned for #MeToo against the rape culture, how can they have been silent over or even try to deny the rapes and sadistic sexual attacks and the burning alive of Israeli women during the October 7 pogrom? The madness, the deranged paranoia and hatred against the Jews, the open desire to see them gone from the world, that was identified with Nazism and we thought was confined to Germany and the barbaric medieval Christian cultures of Eastern Europe, doesn't seem to have been confined there at all. Because now we hear open demonization of the Jews. We hear ancient tropes of Jews controlling the world in their own interests, issuing from the mouths of so-called progressives. We see and hear the paranoid obsession about Jewish power being normalized in our universities, among the professions, across our culture. Countless numbers of ordinary people, well-educated people, really do think that Israel is the rogue state in the Middle East. They really do think that when Jews defend Israel's behavior in the war that followed October 7, they are using anti-Semitism as a shield to deflect acknowledgement of Israel's alleged crimes. They really do think that Israel drives events in the Middle East. They really don't think that Russia, Syria, or Iran drives those events through their aggression. They think that Israel drives those events through defending themselves against them. I believe that the reaction that we've seen in the West to the October 7 pogrom and the war that followed has involved nothing less than the wholesale destruction of conscience, the sense of justice, and rationality itself. And I think we can only begin to understand this extraordinary development if we begin to understand what the West has done to itself over many decades. Because over many decades, the West's intelligentsia, their sort of cultural elites, have attacked the West's core values. Why? Because these cultural elites have told themselves and us ad infinitum that the West was born in the original sins of colonialism, imperialism, and above all the sin of having a white skin, for which we must all do penance. And as a result, we have to abolish the West as a culture and replace it by something rather different and rather better. So in the interests of doing that, we have found attacks over decades on the core institutions that keep a culture going, the education system as a means of transmitting a culture down through the generations. We were told decades ago, can't do that because the culture is so legitimate, you mustn't transmit it down through any generations. An attack on the traditional family as being the sort of key institution that keeps the show on the road by producing children that grow up to be well-adjusted individuals. An attack on the nation itself. The nation itself is a cause of prejudice and war because a nation is an entity which is defined by a particular set of values, a particular culture, particular tradition, particular history, and thus is in itself exclusive of everybody else. And because it's different and exclusive of everybody else, it's a cause itself of prejudice and war. So these institutions have been attacked, and also the core values of the West have been attacked. So, for example, objective truth was abolished. Everybody who's educated knows that anyone who believes there is such a thing as objective, absolute truth is a cretin, an absolute idiot, unsophisticated. Anybody who's educated knows that everything is relative. Everything is a matter of opinion. Everything is to do with how I feel. How I feel trumps any evidence. And so if you abolished objective truth, you abolish the notion of an absolute lie. And if you've abolished the notion of a lie, then you can't ever distinguish a lie from the truth. And consequently, you are open to believing in lies, because after all, it can't be a lie, it's just your opinion. And so instead of truth and lies, we've had ideologies, all of which promote power, all kinds of isms, moral relativism. There's no such thing as truth. My feelings are what matter. My feelings trump any facts. What I feel for me is right. If I feel oppressed by you, I am oppressed by you, even if the evidence is actually you have threatened and attacked me. But I am oppressed by you because I feel it. And I belong to a victim group, and therefore I define myself as a victim and I define you as an oppressor. So when you come to Israel and the Middle East, facts and evidence about Israel can't compete with feelings aroused by TV pictures of suffering Gazan civilians, children and babies, even if there's plenty of evidence these pictures are distorted, taken out of context, whatever. No, I have seen the pictures, I feel compassion and outrage, and that's what actually is the truth. So this division of everybody into groups that are either powerful or powerless has basically driven what we call liberal progressive thinking. And it is absurd. I mean, life is not like that. But on the basis that everything is divided between the powerful and the powerless, you come to Israel, and my goodness, Israel falls foul of this big time, because Israel clearly has power. It has power because it has weapons, it has an army, it has weapons, it has missiles, it has America behind it. It is America. Facing them are people who are armed only with slings and stones. So there is no contest. Israel has power. The Arabs are powerless. As a result of Israel having power, since the powerful can never do any good, Israel can never do any good, and the powerful can never be victims, Israel can never be victims. And conversely, the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza, because they are powerless, miserable, deprived, and oppressed, even if they are killing thousands of people, it's not their fault, it's Israel's fault. Furthermore, Jews in Israel are white oppressors. Now, this is really hilarious because, as you will know, the majority of Jews in Israel are brown-skinned or even black-skinned. But nevertheless, they're white. And when you point out to a leftist, excuse me, Jews in Israel are principally brown-skinned, how can they be having white privilege and be white oppressors? The answer is, even though they're brown-skinned, they're white. And that's because Israelis have power, and all people who have power are white, and all white people have power. End of. Okay. And when it comes to Jews generally in the diaspora, well, of course we're all white, and we're certainly powerful, because as everyone knows, involved in victim culture under the left and beyond, Jews run everything in the world. We run finance, we run economy, we run the law, we run the media, we run everything. And so Jews can never be victims either. And so at the very heart of victim culture, which believes that Jews, including Israeli Jews, are white, represent white power because they run everything, at the very heart of victim culture, which is at the very heart of liberal progressive thinking in our current times, at the very heart of that thinking is a profound hatred and prejudice of Jews as Jews. Now, along with moral relativism, what I feel is right for me is what is right, is cultural relativism. The idea that no culture can be said to be superior to any other. So the West cannot be held to be superior to any other culture. So if we in the West say we believe in freedom of speech and equality for women, and consequently Muslims that don't believe in freedom of speech and equality for women are contravening our core values and must adjust. The response to that is racism, because you must not say that anyone who is not white-skinned Westerner is any worse than you. And of course, we all know that the people who are really bad are white-skinned Westerners. So it's the West that must give way to Islamization, not the other way around. And so this is all to do with this idea, as I said earlier, that the West is fundamentally rotten. And the Western nation state, which is what the West consists of, it consists of nations who uphold Western values and their own national story and their national traditions. That Western nation state has to be seen to be illegitimate. So instead of national laws and values, these must be superseded by transnational institutions and laws, promoting a superior concept, which is a kind of kumbaya brotherhood of man, and John Lennon's Imagine. I'm sure you can all sing along to the lyrics, to the tune of John Lennon's Imagine, in which, where there is no division, there is no religion, there is no country, everything is a kind of wonderful nimbus of wonderfulness, and in terms, there is nothing to fight or die for. So you do not ever fight or die for your nation and its values. Can you think of a country which is fighting and dying for itself and its survival and its values? I can. It begins with an I and it ends with an L. But instead, in the liberal mindset, the liberal universalist brotherhood of man mindset, every single conflict in the world is to be settled by negotiation and compromise. There is no conflict which can't be settled by putting the warring parties in a room and bashing their heads together. Why? Because everyone in the world is like us. It's like the West. Everyone in the world is governed by reason and self-interest. So the idea of having the Ayatollahs of Iran, who believe that it's the work of God that they are doing in eradicating Israel and the Jewish people, and that therefore you cannot negotiate with lunatics like that, because if people believe they are enjoined to mass murder because it's a sacred duty, that is a non-negotiable agenda, the Western liberal says, no. Of course that can't be true. Basically, all they want is to be like you and me. All they want is a nice life. All they want is self-interest. And of course we can negotiate with them. And so Israel must negotiate with them. And Israel says, well, excuse me, we'd rather not lie down and die. And then it's Israel that's blamed for standing in the way of this great ideological fixation. Because to the liberal mind, every conflict has to be settled by negotiation and compromise. Lions will lie down with lambs. And in the conflict between genocide and its intended victims, the Western liberal will split the difference. And so we have the entire panoply of the international, transnational establishment which apparently embodies conscience, the conscience of the West. The whole humanitarian human rights establishment, the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the great NGOs, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch. When these people speak, they are believed. They are the new priesthood. It's like, bishops of the church speaking. They speak perfect truth because they stand for collective international conscience. And so we find the International Criminal Court has launched arrest warrants against Israel's Prime Minister and former Defense Minister for war crimes and crimes against humanity, which is how they've labelled Israel's more than just war being performed with unprecedented concern to secure civilian lives as far as possible. The International Court of Justice has denounced Israel for illegal occupation in flagrant disregard of what international law actually says. And all these legal actions are based on lies provided by international actors, actually the great NGOs who are in bed with the UN and so on, and the ICC, international actors who want Israel destroyed. And so we have the United Nations, the supposed engine of international peace and justice that year after year singles out Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, for more censure than all the tyrannies of the world put together, employs open anti-Semites to lead campaigns of harassment against Israel, and since October 7, we have seen over and over again, has been shown to be in bed with Hamas itself. But the Western world can't criticize the Islamic world. The Islamic world, as I say, is always the victim of the West because the West has global power. So the West cannot acknowledge not only the injustice, to put it mildly, against Israel by all this worldview, but it can't acknowledge the threat to itself from the world of Islam. The Islamists, whose intention is to conquer the West, to subject it to Islam, and they say that the whole time. The West doesn't even listen to this. Now, a key bridgehead between the liberal progressives and the Islamic world, who are marching together on the streets of our Western cities, a key bridgehead that brings them together is support for the Palestinian cause. And the Palestinian cause has had an effect on the West, I think, which is not properly understood. It's not simply that it's wrong and has caused a lot of people to behave in an unpleasant or even dangerous way. I think it has knocked the West completely off its moral compass. For this reason, the Palestinian cause is a lie from start to finish. It's a lie at all kinds of levels. There is no such thing as the Palestinian people. The Arabs who came pouring into Palestine, mandate Palestine between the 1920s and the 1940s, were drawn in large measure from Egypt, from Syria, and from many other countries. Many of them were illegal immigrants. Some of them were people who lived in the land for a long time. There were people, back in 1917 when the Balfour Declaration was issued in Britain, there were people living in Palestine. They were Arabs, but they were Bedouin, they were nomads, they were part of the Arab nation. And there were also Jews living there. There were Jews living there, in Sfat constantly. There was a majority Jewish population in Jerusalem from the middle of the 19th century, and so on. But there was no Palestinian people. We all know, as a child, I had a tin marked, Palestine National Fund. It was for Jews. The Palestine National Post, all the sort of Palestine adjective was applied to Jews. Jews are the indigenous people of the land. The Jewish people, the central conceit of Palestinianism, which is that the Palestinian people was a people, and they were the original indigenous people of the land, and they were therefore displaced by the Jews who had no connection to the land after the Holocaust, is a complete lie. The Jews are the indigenous people of the land. The Jews are the only people for whom it was ever their national kingdom, centuries before Islam was even created. Palestinianism, the Palestinian identity, a false identity, was invented for one reason only: to steal the land that properly belongs to the Jews from them. But worse than that, what Palestinianism does is not just an intention to steal the land. It is to steal the Jews' own history in the land from them. It denies the history, and it replaces the Jews by themselves in the most extraordinary way. Now, there are many other lies as part of this big lie, but unfortunately, for the reasons that I've already set out, Western liberals cannot separate truth from lies because everything is just an opinion. And furthermore, we're all shocked by the open Jew hatred coming out of Western liberal mouths. Jew hatred tropes which, they're redolent of the Nazis, they're redolent of medieval Christian demonology of Jews. But it's not really surprising, because the cause they support, the Palestinian cause, means they support the Palestinian Authority as their sort of go-to people. Forget the Hamas for a minute. The Palestinian Authority pumps out daily demonization, not just of Israel, but of Jews, couched in terms of Islamic holy war, couched in terms of Nazi demonology, Nazi-type tropes, portraying Jews sometimes in graphic cartoon form as predatory insects, snakes, who are literally controlling the entire world. I mean, these are the images of our nightmares from past genocidal anti-Semites, and it's kind of coming out of the mouths of Western liberals, because Western liberals have embraced the cause that is actually producing these tropes day after day. Western liberals, in supporting the Palestinian cause, are supporting latter-day Nazism. And this is not an exaggeration. We should all be very careful about imputing Nazi-type imagery, or saying that people are Nazis, or comparing with the Holocaust. Except that in this case, there is a lot of truth in it, because these IDF soldiers coming back from Gaza, they report virtually every house has a copy of Mein Kampf in it, and we can hear the Nazi demonology coming out of the Palestinian Authority. And Mahmoud Abbas, who we're told is the statesman in waiting who is entitled to run a state of his own in Palestine, he has said many times His great role model, his great hero, is the guy who was the chief mufti of Jerusalem in the 1930s, Haj Amin al-Husseini. And Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, met with Hitler and said to Hitler, if you win the war, I, the Grand Mufti, will exterminate every Jew in the Middle East. Not just in Palestine, in the Middle East. Some people say that it was the Grand Mufti who gave Hitler the idea of the final solution, but if he didn't, he certainly was an enthusiastic supporter. This is the man who is the role model of the moderate leader, of the moderate Palestinians, who we're all told every 5 seconds are entitled to a state of their own, which will bring peace to the Middle East. This is madness. And, again, one should not draw the comparison with the Holocaust, but my goodness me, I'm sure you all had the same reaction as I did when we saw the pictures of those 3 hostages who were released. We all knew what that reminded us of. And it's not a coincidence. It is the same ideology. I always think, and I have said on occasion, that the Palestinian cause is the last great front of the Second World War. And that's how we should see it. But that's what Western liberals are supporting. And we have to stick it to them that that's what they are supporting. This is the cause that Western liberals use to signal their own moral worth. This is the amazing thing. So we are clearly living in a kind of looking glass world in which black is white, truth is lies, facts are unfacts. It's a kind of madness, it's a kind of Orwellian nightmare that we're living through, of moral inversion and a hijack of language to turn lies into facts and facts into lies, to screw the Western brain and to gaslight the Jews and other supporters of Israel. And this deranged looking glass world is the hallmark of what was the Soviet Union, and it's also the hallmark of Islamic thinking. And let me unpick that for a moment. It's no coincidence that the two thinkings have coincided like this, because Islamist thinkers, that is the thinkers who came out of the 1920s and 1930s and who basically kind of invented what we've been living through, which is Islamism, this desire to wage holy war against the Western world, against the free world. They were heavily influenced by Soviet communism because the two thought processes are very similar. They are both totalitarian thought systems that mess with the brain by turning reality inside out. Now, we all know how the Soviet Union did that, but here's the thing. Islam does it as well, and here's how it does it. It's a complete reversal of reality for this reason. It believes, it holds, that Islam is the word of God. No questioning that, and that the world of Islam is the world of the sacred and the world of goodness and all good things, and the non-Islamic world is the province of the devil and is only bad things. So anything that the Islamic world does, including killing people, is good because it's doing the work of God. Whereas anything that the non-Islamic world does, which we would say is defense against aggression, that's bad because it's the non-Islamic world and is the world of the devil. So everything is backwards. It's like going through the looking glass. For example, there was a British academic called Garda Kami, who I saw a quote from her a few days ago, and she said this: "I want to pay tribute to Hamas. It has been completely demonized. We need to work towards ridding the world of Israel. It cannot be reformed and made to join the human family." Now, most of us would say that applies to Hamas. And she has inverted it. Now, did she invert it because she was being cynical and was setting out to confuse everybody? I don't know this lady. I don't think she was being cynical at all. I think she actually believes it. She really does believe it. Because in her mind, everything is through the looking glass. Now, these Islamist thinkers of the 1920s onwards fused Islamic theological hatred of the Jews with Stalinism. Both of them hated Jews. The Grand Mufti made this pact with Hitler, and so on, and moved forward into the 1960s, and here you have again this fusion. Yasser Arafat went to the Soviet Union, and they cooked up between them Palestinian identity from nothing. In order to confuse the Western intellectual brain, it would enable Arafat to have this supreme weapon against Israel, which has worked so well, and it enabled the Soviet Union, it gave the Soviet Union a weapon to mess with the Western brain and soften it up and cause chaos and confusion in order to further the ambitions of the Soviet Union to take over the West. And so the result of all this madness, I would suggest, is that it seems to me that both Hitler and Stalin have had a kind of posthumous victory. They could hardly have imagined that their separate projects to destroy the Jewish people and conquer the minds of the free world would, less than a century later, have brought Western civilization to the edge of the cultural cliff. And here's the other thing. The Islamists understand the West better than the West understands itself. They understand, the Islamists understand one very, very big thing. They understand that without a religious core, a society is nothing. It loses its sense of identity, it collapses, and it cannot defend itself. And they have correctly understood that the West for decades has been eroding its core and has really got rid of religion, broadly speaking, and replaced it with all these ideologies, which are ideologies of the self, the individual, me and my feelings, and all the rest of it. We won't go to war, it's kumbaya, it's John Lennon's Imagine, everything's a negotiation. And, they've correctly understood that the West, therefore, is theirs for the taking. And furthermore, they have also understood another really big thing, which the West does not understand at all, and it's partly why I wrote my book. Because the Islamists understand how crucial Judaism is to the West. Now, we all know that the foundational creed of the West is Christianity. What is less well appreciated is that Christianity didn't come from nothing, it came from Judaism. I mean, we all know that Christianity is basically a Jewish sect that got out of hand. And the values at the very core of the West, the values that even secular liberals say, these are our core values, freedom of speech and equality for women and compassion and conscience and justice and rule of law and democracy. Actually, those things came originally from the Jews. The secular liberals may say, well, they're imprinted in the human DNA, they're universal. Well, no, they're not. They're not, China doesn't have them, Russia doesn't have them, the Islamic world doesn't have them, hardly anybody has them. It's the West that had them. And why does the West have them? Well, because of Christianity. And why did Christianity have them? Well, because of the Jews. Right. So it's Judaism. Judaism gave the world its notion of individual conscience, the internalization of right and wrong, respect for human life, moral responsibility, and duty to others. And these principles have been replaced today by ideologies which are all about putting the individual first. But there is more about what Jews did to the West, which people really, really don't know. For example, the rule of law, rooted in the consent of the people, was a revolutionary concept introduced in ancient Israel. Moses brought the tablets down from the mountain, and then he said, so what do you think, guys? And the Jewish people said, yeah, we agree. We hear and we'll do. It was the consent of the people. This was a revolutionary concept. This bucked the trend of ancient cultures where the ruler, was despotic. And the second point, which is related, is that the ancient kings of Israel represented a limited government. Okay, some of them were despots, but the template for them was that they weren't absolute rulers because they were answerable to God Almighty, and at their level they were also constrained by people called judges and prophets. And so these two things, rule of law rooted in consent of the people and limited government, were fantastically important when it came to the 18th century thinkers who created what became parliamentary democracy in Britain. Where they created Parliament, they gave Parliament powers to constrain the powers of the king and the church. They drew explicitly on Hebrew scripture, and then they went to America and founded America, and the framers of the American constitutional settlement drew explicitly on the Hebrew scriptures. So Jewish values are the very centre, the very core, not just of moral values, but actually what became democracy and freedom. And so it's not surprising, therefore, that Jews are at the eye of the storm, as we are at the moment. Because if you have a situation where, the West has set out to destroy itself and its core values, well, those core values actually are largely Jewish. And furthermore, the Jews are the conscience of the West, and conscience is a terrible nuisance. Conscience gets in the way of self-interest. If you have a whole set of ideologies based on the self, you can't be doing with conscience, you can't be doing with these Jews and their infernal conscience the whole time. And also, conscience works hand in hand with guilt. And the West happens to be burdened with unbearable guilt over the Holocaust. It believes that it was complicit in this terrible thing. And so to get rid of conscience and to rid itself finally of the intolerable burden of guilt for the Nazi genocide, the West accuses the Jews themselves of genocide and tries to expel them from its mind and its heart by tearing down the evidence that the Jews actually represent something that is valuable. So, to draw my remarks slowly to a close, I would say this. You may say, so is it all over for the West? And many people think that it is. And I would say absolutely not. The difficulties are formidable in saving the West, but everything is to play for. And we know that because millions of people have basically risen up in Britain and in Europe in particular and in America against a whole political establishment which has basically said, we're against the nation state, we're against its fundamental Western values, we're for universalism and all those things. We no longer want border controls, we want multiculturalism, the idea of a specific culture is racist, let them all come in. All of that, millions are rising up against that. We might not like the populist so-called politicians and parties that are springing up, but that's not the point. Millions want their Western civilization back. And the dividing lines, I would suggest, are no longer what they used to be, if they were ever valid. They're no longer left versus right, black versus white, men versus women, gays versus straights. They're no longer one religion versus another. They're no longer people of religion versus, on the other hand, people of no religion. The division, I think, that really matters now is between those from all those groups who love the West, respect and admire its values, understand its values, and want the West to continue as the West, and those from all those groups who hate the West and want it destroyed. And that's the battleground. And what I've said in my book is that what I think we should all try and do, difficult as it is to form a kind of counter-cultural resistance, a kind of alliance for civilization, which draws on all the people from all those groups who get it, who want the West to continue. And I set out a kind of 10-point program for such a resistance movement, composed of people who love the West and want it to survive, but who crucially understand that if it is to do so, it must once again base itself on the Jewish and Christian values that gave it its greatness. And I think that the defense of the Jewish people will only come from those from all these groups who are setting out to defend the Western nation and its core values. The defense of the Jewish people is never going to come from the liberal wing of politics. That wing is finished. It is blowing itself up on its own ideological fixations. And here's the other thing. If the West wants to save itself, What is the Jewish people's unique selling point? What do we do more than anything else? We do cultural survival. We have survived everything that anybody could ever throw at us. Okay, we've taken grievous losses, lost millions over the centuries through persecution, extermination, assimilation. But here we are still here, and we are thriving, and we have created this miraculous place called the State of Israel out of the ashes of nothing less than the Holocaust itself. So we do cultural survival. So if the West wants to survive, they could learn something from the Jews about how to keep the civilization show on the road, because we know how to do it. I'm certainly not suggesting that everyone should become a Jew. Nor am I suggesting everyone should become a religious person. But I am suggesting that all those who want to survive, or who want the West to survive, must understand that it can only do so if it reaffirms itself as being bound by certain core values which are not universal values. We should consign John Lennon to history. They are the values of the Bible that we have to restore. And Jews must help others fight the ideologies that define secular society, all these isms that have taken us to the edge of the cultural cliff. We and others in our alliance for civilization must fight these ideologies on the grounds of their moral bankruptcy, their inversion of right and wrong and truth and lies. And we have a role to play in showing how our culture preserves itself by connecting its present to its past in order to have a future. And we can show how this is done, how we've done it, through the primacy of education, through reverence for the traditional family as the best guarantor of emotional resilience for the next generation, and the transmission of cultural memory through celebrating the West's achievements and memorializing its losses. And I think also we can help the Christian churches in many ways, connecting religion to everyday life, taking it out of the church and into the kitchen, the bedroom, the workplace. And I think that we as Jews should not confine our attention to Israel or the Jewish people at all. We should be forming alliances with Christians, black people and others to condemn the terrible anti-civilizational outrages which are the persecution of Christians in Africa, China and the Islamic world, which has resulted in the mass murder and oppression of black and Asian Christians, the burning of churches and ethnic cleansing of Christians, real ethnic cleansing, as part of the Islamists' war to destroy Christian civilization. We should be sounding the alarm with our Christian friends. We should be forming an alliance with our Christian friends and allies in common cause against these anti-civilized civilization outrages. We should also help draw attention to the institutionalized slavery, which, contrary to the progressives' libel against the West, is mostly concentrated in Islamic, African and communist societies. We should be naming these societies and forming alliances to draw attention to the fact that we, the West, and the core peoples of the West are standing against this. We as Jews need to speak up against this persecution and enslavement. In conclusion, finally, I would say this unprecedented onslaught against the Jewish people has occurred because the Jews are central to Western civilization, a society against which the West itself has so self-destructively turned. October 7, in my view, turbocharged the West's decades-long process of cultural suicide. What Jews and Israel's other supporters need to do is not just to defend Israel better and to fight anti-Semitism more effectively. We also need to understand what Israel has been teaching the rest of the world since October the 7th. What's it been teaching the rest of the world? Well, Israel will survive. This is what it's been teaching us. Israel will survive. Why? Because it knows what it is. It loves what it is. It will not try to water down what it is. It wants its children and its grandchildren to continue to share in its values and achievements as a state of Israel that embodies the timeless values and principles of the Jewish people, for which it is a sacred duty to continue. Israel is a nation defending its right to exist within its own territory in order to uphold its particular culture and its sacred duty to continue the survival of the Jewish people. It will survive because it embodies the strategy of the Jewish people in ensuring its own cultural survival. The same cannot be said of the West, which is as a result sliding towards the edge of the cultural cliff. The Jews of Israel are showing the West how a nation and a culture chooses life, not death. The West... Tragically, the West can't see this. So we as Jews need to help open the eyes of the West. If the West is to survive, it needs to learn to love the Jewish people. It needs to realise not just the kind of strategic importance to it of the state of Israel. It needs to realise the importance of the Jews to its own culture and its own survival. It needs to realise that the Jews are the eternal people, but without the Jews, the West itself will not survive. The Western culture that stands against the Jews is going down. The West will survive if it decides to love us instead of disdaining us and trying to erase what makes the Jewish people special and which has made the West special too. This is a seismic moment in world history that we're living through. It is an inflection point for civilization. It's also the Jewish moment. Israel understands this very well. Much of the Arab world has come to understand precisely that as well. Now it's time for everybody in the West who wants civilization to survive to understand it too. Thank you very much.